Hi, I'm Cynthia Lummis, chairman of the Senate Western Caucus, and I'm here today with U.S. Senator from Montana, Tim Sheehy. We're talking about a subject about which Tim Sheehy has tremendous expertise, and we're so blessed to have him as a member of the U.S. Senate. And that, of course, is the wildfire situation in this country. You know, Tim, the last few years, wildfires are costing this country about $3 billion just in the cost to contain them and put them out, not including insurance costs, the loss of livestock, the loss of life, the loss of buildings, and renewing the economy that a fire leaves behind. And you have some really insightful plans to address this. We want to call it to everyone's attention. So, could you start with the president's executive order? No, wait a minute. Could you start with why you have expertise in this subject?
Well, as you know, for those of us in the western states, west of the Mississippi, especially in our mountainous regions, we live with wildfire as a reality every day, and in some cases year round. Wildfires are oftentimes viewed as something that's a regional, seasonal issue. And the truth is, it's becoming a national year-round issue. From Lahaina, Hawaii, that we saw a couple years ago, devastation wiped that town off the map, to the Smokehouse Creek fire in Texas last year, to New Jersey last fall. We had some terrible fires in New Jersey, to, of course, L.A. last winter in January, I might add. That was not a July-August fire. That happened in January. So what we're realizing is due to several factors, wildfires are now a daily 50-state year-round issue.
And no longer just a forest issue.
Exactly. Yeah, the wildland-urban interface is becoming the true front line of the wildfire crisis. And my background to this is a lot of personal experience. I've been an aerial firefighter fighting wildfires for the last decade, so flying air attack, aerial surveillance, and water bombing, the planes that come in and drop water on the fires. I've personally fought wildfire on the ground as recently as about 2 weeks ago on my ranch. We had a lightning strike cause wildfire, so I was personally out there digging handline. I've had several fires we fought on our ranch, our neighbors' ranches, and on our farm. And then my wife has two brothers with Down syndrome, and their family runs a farm for special needs children, and it was burned last year in a wildfire as well. So many personal connection points to the subject of wildfire. And how I got involved in it really was my military experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, leading SEAL teams on various types of missions. We had air support that provided us a fantastic array of data, infrared data, hyperspectral, electro-optic, and it gave us situational awareness so that we had better capabilities to make decisions in real time on the battlefield. And about the time I was starting to get out of the military, there was a report released that debriefed the Yarnell Mountain fire in Arizona. And if you remember, that fire was in 2013, and the Granite Mountain hotshots were responding to a fire in the mountains of Arizona. And the wind shifted, the RH dropped, and the fire, frankly, became too aggressive. And the team leader said, "You know what? We got to get out of here, team. We're gonna move to a safe zone." And unfortunately, that decision was made. It was the right decision made with the wrong information. And his team moved to an area that was not a safe zone, and they were all burned alive and killed in the line of duty.
Yeah, it was
19
horrible,
firefighters.
just devastating. Absolutely.
And I realized
horrible.
at that moment, if I'd been in his shoes as a team leader with 19, 20 guys underneath me on the side of a mountain in the desert, load down with gear, I realized if he had the tools that I'd had forward deployed during the war, it's very likely him and his team would have been alive. So I entered the aerial firefighting arena with that perspective. And my first week in the Senate, as you know, this January is when the terrible fires in L.A. kicked off. And I realized at that moment that an issue that I already had felt passionate about, I actually wrote a book about it called Mudslingers that talked about the history of aerial fire defending and how we can fix this topic. I realized this was the time for America to act. This is America first common sense. If we can't protect our communities from burning to the ground, then we got a lot more work to do. So,
Well, you were meant to be in the U.S. Senate at this time, and the good news is that you have taken the next steps. So, walk us through the president's new executive order and what you intend to do legislatively to help implement that.
well, it's a very fixable problem set. And actually, it's a fairly straightforward set of fixes, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It's like telling someone, "Hey, it's just deadlift 500 pounds. Just pick it up. It's straightforward. All you got to do is pick it up." It's like, okay, it is straightforward. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. So it's a very multifaceted approach, and it's going to take both legislative, executive order, and secretarial actions to eventually solve this crisis we have. So number one, our first thing we did was introduce the Aerial Firefighting Enhancement Act and 18 other bills related largely to technical considerations around wildfire response. One of them is the Fire Ready Nation Act, which we just passed yesterday through the Senate. That was, and all these bills, I might add, are bipartisan. Every single one has bipartisan co-sponsors. And these bills are solving things like technology deployment to wildfires, military equipment availability for wildfires, removing some of these very basic barriers that exist for no good reason other than, as you know, just bureaucracy getting in the way. Some more larger legislation that's more landscape shifting is the Fix Our Forest Act, which I know you're very familiar with, and that'll help us bring common sense back to our timber management, revive our timber industry, and get the litigation out of common sense land management decisions. Because, you know, if you want to build a road or assign a timber lease or even open a mining project or do a prescribed burn to harden a community from wildfire, you could be set up for decades of litigation. And fire doesn't respect litigation or permits or Endangered Species Act. The fire is going to burn when it's going to burn. And if we're not ready to defend against it, that's a problem. And the president, to his credit, when I reached out to him early on this, was immediately responsive. And his executive order essentially stated the following, which is, we are to be ready to protect our communities from wildfire nationwide, year-round, no more excuses. And he's directed the secretaries primarily of Agriculture and Interior, because those are the equities that are responsible here, to consolidate their efforts and unify their efforts into one single firefighting organization. Because one of the issues that has dogged us throughout this wildfire crisis as it's gotten worse is there's so many organizations that have responsibility, but they all have different leaders, different budgets, different strategies, different tools, and they rarely agree on anything. And that leads to kind of this bureaucratic hot potato that it can take days, if ever, sometimes, that they may respond to a wildfire as BLM and BIA and Park Service and Forest Service and state and county, they all try to mesh themselves together and figure out what the solution is. So simplifying the process, unifying the strategy, and resourcing our firefighters.
And the land ownership patterns in a fire can create some of those complicated who's responsible issues, where you have BLM next to Forest Service, next to private land, next to a county park. How do you get that level of coordination under your plan?
So you hit the nail on the head. Wildfire responsibility is emanated from land ownership and land management. So that made sense 100 years ago when so many of these lands were so remote that, frankly, no one really cared if they burned. Right. And we have to also be honest with ourselves that the best cure for bad fire is good fire. Forests are supposed to burn. Prairies are supposed to burn. Fire is a natural part of the landscape, and we've made it so hard to conduct prescribed burns that we've lost, in many cases, that part of the ecosystem. But in answer to your question, that checkerboarded land ownership model, as federal agencies and state agencies and county agencies have diverged over the years in their land management practices, Mother Nature doesn't care where the line on the map is. They don't see sections. They don't see it in a 640-acre section. They don't see a county line. All they see is that ecosystem is one ecosystem, and it's going to be treated equally. So what this does is it unifies all wildfire response on government land under one single organization. That organization, the National Wildland Fire Service, which has now been flagged and created through the President's EO, we should see it rolling out here in the coming weeks. That organization, instead of having 5 different agencies within just the Department of Interior, has 5 different firefighting organizations just in one agency. Mm. Then that doesn't even start talking about the Forest Service and state agencies. We have dozens of agencies around the country who fight fire. This will unify into one organization like the DoD, where there's one accountable leader, one set of contracting regulations, one set of employment laws, one funding source, and most importantly, clear lines of communication, clear lines of authority and accountability, so that when we have a city burning to the ground, it's not the city pointing to the state, pointing to the county, pointing to the feds. Everyone's saying it's not my fault, it's their fault. There's one person who's responsible.
This is the most transformative structure that we've seen come along for government to address the multifaceted agencies that can be involved in a fire. Will the legislation be focused towards this new agency?
Yes, so the legislation will be setting conditions, number one, to make this enduring. As you know far better than I, you've been here a lot longer than I have and understand the way that the place works is, executive action is great, but executive action can also be undone as soon as the next administration comes in. And although I think wildfire is a bipartisan issue, and I hope it wouldn't be undone, sometimes, things happen. So legislation will allow us to make permanent these changes that we're enacting through executive and secretarial action. But most importantly, what it'll do is it'll give us the legal framework to have certainty. And as you know, as we've seen Keystone XL and coal mines and oil and gas permits, as you know, Wyoming's energy economy has been devastated by activist government intervention. This will give certainty to our timber industry, to our federal agencies, so they can come up with 5, 10, 20-year forest management plans that aren't going to get knocked off the rails by either environmental litigation or just, government incompetence. This will give us a legal framework that we can start managing the defense of our communities better. Because what the issue that's hitting many of our communities is that there isn't a common rubric that we can adopt that hardens our communities from a defensive perspective, i.e. vegetation up to and including the urban interface, building codes that include houses, backyards, farms, ranches that exist in that interface, response codes that require response time for those, and the reality that normally the first agency responding to a wildfire is typically not the smoke jumpers or the hot shots. It's normally a local volunteer fire department that is probably resourced to fight a house fire.
Right, but has knowledge of the lay of the land.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that we should know as we watch the rollout of this legislation and its convergence with the president's executive order?
It is a national security and national economic imperative we do this. Wildfire is no longer a boutique Western lands management issue. You mentioned the cost of $3 billion earlier, which is accurate as far as direct suppression spending. But we spend about $100 billion a year on wildfire-related suppression and recovery efforts. And the LA fire alone is the most expensive disaster of any kind in American history. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, you name it. $250 billion, $250 billion for one fire that lasted, a couple of weeks. So when you look at that impact, 14,000 structures destroyed. You look at Lahaina, the Camp Fire that destroyed Paradise, California, 1.6 million acres in Texas last year. When you look at the damage those cause, those create an instability and it's a torpedo heading towards the hull of our economy because homeowners insurance policies that underwrite all of these have assumed a fire risk level that is no longer valid. And as those premiums go up by 2, 3, 9, 10, 15x, or even worse, when you can't get homeowners insurance because of a fire risk anymore, what can't you get without insurance? You can't get a mortgage. Mortgage requires you have an insurance to insure the level of the mortgage. And everyone's got a mortgage on their home. So that creates a home liquidity crisis that when you can't buy or sell your home or refi it, get a home equity line of credit because you can't get insurance, that potentially could be a bigger impact on our national housing market than what we saw in 2008 and 2009. So I think the specific tactical considerations and forest management and land management considerations around wildfire are very important. I think it's important, even more important, that we zoom out and make sure people understand the full scope of this issue. Because if we don't address wildfire in a way that insurance underwriters, regardless of what you think of insurance underwriters, I know a lot of farmers in ranches in Montana hate their insurance. They say, there's one guy down the street of me who's got a banner on his tractor that says State Farm is not a good neighbor. They do not pay their claims. And I've had a good experience with my underwriters, but you never know. But they have to run a business and they have to be able to underwrite the risk. And right now they're saying we can't, and they're backing out of wildfire-prone communities. And if that happens at scale, which it's starting to, we're going to have a homeowner's insurance, mortgage, and then economic crisis as a result. So we need to buttress our ability to secure and defend our communities from wildfire, and it is an economic security and a national security issue.
This really is the most transformative government approach that we've seen to address this issue. I'm so glad you're involved. I'm so glad you understand this issue at the literal firefighting level. And have brought it to the attention of the whole nation. Thanks for working with the president on his executive order and this legislation that you are going to work with Senator Mike Lee and others to shepherd through the U.S. Senate and make it possible for us to speak with one voice to these horrific fires that have become so commonplace in our country. Senator Tim Sheehy of Montana, thank you so much for being with us. This is the Senate Western Caucus with Senator Tim Sheehy. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia.